Record. Welcome, everybody. You are here for our second in the series of 4 FSC trainings for this year. Today, we welcome you to keep your camera on if you're at all able to. If not, we totally understand that. Our speaker today is Dr. Peggy Kemp, and the title of her session is Building Family Strengths and Resilience with the RBI. So welcome, Peggy.
Thank you, Jenny. Thank you, everyone, for being here today. As Jenny said, I am Peggy Kemp, and I know some of you, but there are many, many new faces. I worked full-time for the kids program up till about 7 years ago, but now I do most of my time behind the scenes, serving as a trainer and co-director of the kids program. I'm also the executive director for the Division for Early Childhood, so that's why I moved to part-time. But before I left Kansas full-time, I have been in most, if not all, of your programs. Have a bit of information about how your RBIs work, and of course have talked to my colleagues who work with you every day now about some of the things that are challenging and where everyone sort of is in the routine space interview, etc. So hopefully we answer your questions today, but I also invite you to put any questions into the chat now, and as we move forward that come to mind. One of the things I want to make sure that you know is this isn't a full RBI training. I am certified to do RBI trainings, went through the training with Robin McWilliam and his team at their institute when they were in Tennessee, and keep up to all of their new things. But this isn't what would certify you to be a routine-based interviewer. And the difference probably is a lot of practice and a lot of fidelity checks and a lot of more conversation. So today was refreshing. And I know by refreshing, that means that some of you have a little bit of experience with the routine space interview. Some of you have been doing it for a decade or more. So there'll be a little bit of refreshing of the basics, but also some talking about things that often, questions people often have, or things that throw them a bit with the RBI. So we'll go from there, what it is and what it isn't. We hope today that you walk away with an introduction to the administration of the RBI. We hope that you understand the purpose of the RBI, not only as a tool developed by Robin McWilliams, but in Kansas. Why are you asked to use the routine-based interview? And who else might be using it in the United States and beyond? And we also hope that you think with us a little bit about the link between a routine-based interview and really equity in serving the families that we serve. So right away, if you have any questions you came with, please put those in the chat. We may not address them right away, but towards the end of my conversation, we're going to have a few frequently asked questions, challenges. Hopefully we hit what your questions are there. And if we have any leftover questions that don't get answered today, I know that as a team, we'll make sure and put out a frequently asked questions document of some type as well. Bottom line is you should have your questions answered today. And if not, we'll find a way to make that happen. So I can't see any of your faces because if I look at your faces, I can't see my slides. So my teammates are going to watch the chat for me, and they'll just interrupt me when needed. And we'll go ahead and forward. So most of you know this, like, why does the IFSP, how does it help us here in Kansas? And a long time ago, when we adapted the IFSP in Kansas, we wanted to really use the routine-based interview as part of the development of the My Child story. by doing that, and probably, hopefully all of you know that my child's story equals current levels of performance. And by fleshing out the current levels of performance with the family, we know that you'll get a rich and deep description of where the child is in the context of their everyday routines, the places they want to be with and need to be with their family, in their community and in their schools, be that childcare or preschool or whatever version of school they attend. So we use it for two purposes, primarily flesh out the current level of performances, and most importantly, to get outcomes that are really developed in the context of that family's routines and by the family based on their own priorities. We'll talk a little bit later about the fact that we're not looking for what the child cannot do in a routines-based interview. We are looking for what the needs are in those interviews. And the purpose of early intervention is that if we look in the law and we look at the regulations, the purpose of early intervention is to focus on the child and family's needs, concerns, priorities. So the other thing that an RBI does is it helps us to really build concerns, resources, and priority page that's informed by the RBI, and for those of you that use the ECHO, by the ECHO map. We won't talk much about the ECHO map today, not enough time to be honest, but happy to, if that, or not happy, but if that becomes something that everyone wants to learn about, we'll go a little deeper in that another time. So, adaptation. The routines-based interview is probably, just a second, not a standardized assessment. It's not a curriculum-based assessment, granted. However, increasingly, and in Kansas, I know some of you use the routines-based interview as a means to score your instruments using some of the information you collected in the RBI. And really, that's probably the most time effective way to use the routines-based interview. But not only that, it is one of the ways that we can avoid asking families the same questions over and over. And so we can think, I hope you think about that if you haven't already, and think about that as we go through the conversation today. And how do you know, though, if you're using the RBI to score your instruments, how do you know you're really getting the type of information required by the instruments? Well, first of all, a lot of our curriculum-based assessments should be completed by observation or interview with the family anyway, so it really fits the way the instruments were designed. Another way to measure if you are using the RBI scoring instruments, if you're on track, is really think about if greater than 10% of the children you test all of a sudden start becoming ineligible. You probably want to question the RBI and how you're using it. But for most children in Kansas, we know either from a diagnosis before we entered the house that the child will be eligible due to auto eligibility, or from hundreds of home visits myself and going with all of you, we pretty well know, either from the intake phone call or the first few minutes of the visit, if we're looking at a child that's likely eligible. We'll talk a bit more about the children. The only time I probably would advise against using the RBI first is if you really, really don't know if this child's going to be eligible or not, because the RBI does take a lot of time, a lot of emotional investment. One of the primary reasons for an RBI is to establish a relationship with the family. And if we're not staying with that family, that doesn't make as much sense. So those are just some things to think about when we try to think about, do we evaluate first? Or do we do the RBI first? Some states screen children at intake and make the decision about the RBI, kind of like I said, we have the feeling in the first, little bit after an intake call or being in the house. So there are lots of points in which you can choose to use the RBI. But the RBI does assess for needs. So just that's a great thing to plant in your head. In IDEA, the law that we follow to guide all of our pieces of early intervention from intake to transition is Part C of IDEA. And in Part C of IDEA, in the regulations, it actually mentions a routine-based assessment for family assessment. That said, again, the RBI is also a child assessment and was actually designed primarily as a child assessment. And because we're working with families and we are talking about their needs as well, it can count as our family assessment as well. So get comfortable with those ideas, hopefully. And the reason, of course, is to not ask families the same questions over and over, to minimize the amount of time that you need for assessments, before we get to the IFSP, knowing that we don't have any time that we can waste, if lack of a better term, on duplication of effort or on doing something that's not needed. So those are decisions you'll make program by program. But again, just really remembering the point of early intervention is to focus on needs. Needs show up in routines. We're focusing on function, which is participation. And we see function during independence and social relationships and participation. So I think we went over most of what I have on this slide, but just give you a minute to sort of take it in. No developmental ages or quotients. There's been no attempt to do so like we see with like the AAPS. But it does give us a good description again of both child and family functioning. Is part of the child assessment, is part of family assessment. And it helps us have good outcomes. So that's one of the primary things we're thinking about from the minute we start the RBI. So we talked again a bit about when's the best time to conduct it, but definitely, ideally, we want to conduct the RBI after intake, but before we select services, which usually we're selecting services at the IFSP meeting. But we'll talk about later, there's always a workaround, and some people have figured out some workarounds, but ideally that's where we'd place it. And ideally you'd update your RBI every 3 months. We know that realistically it's probably 6 months at the 6-month review, but definitely you want to review the RBI every year. And make sure that it's part of ongoing assessment is what I was going to say, and not necessarily only for eligibility when we enter the system, but that idea of ongoing assessment, which is also in IDEA. And there are some tools that really help you look at maybe a shortened version of the IDEA as well that we can share with you. So, kind of a big deal. What do you need to do an RBI? You need strong child development knowledge. And I know that each one of us feels we've got probably a pretty strong child development foundation. The one thing I do want to share with you is nationally, it's really not true. And it's across disciplines. Our child development knowledge isn't as strong as we wish it was when we first come out of pre-service, for sure. And with time, sometimes we can see some slippage, especially when we're working with children with disabilities all of the time. So, I always think about when my youngest, who's now 25, and my grandchildren, this happens, I think they are just magically gifted every time they meet a developmental milestone, and for sure they're doing it early. And at least that was the case when I was working mostly with children with delays and disabilities. And I'd go check the chart and be like, nope, sure enough, they're right on time. But that's that slippage. So I say all that to really encourage you, not just for the RBI, but for your setting outcomes, for your conversations with the families, for how you provide intervention to make sure your child development knowledge is really strong. You also need a good sense of family functioning, and most of us didn't get that at pre-service. So if you didn't get any pre-service training or haven't had any in-service training, that really helps you understand all families, families who are in marginalized communities, families who are of different race, different ethnicity, families who have different structures, be it friends' families or families with same-sex parents, families that are separated and divorced, and there's conflict, or families that are separated and divorced and there's no conflict. There's so many things that, as you know, because you deal with it every day, so many ways and so many family functioning. And there are absolutely sets of knowledge and skills that we can gain, if you haven't already, in really supporting family and understanding family functioning. And good conversational skills. Honestly, the routines-based interview is a conversation, and actually I prefer to go to families and as part of the way that I describe it as a conversation. Interview seems a little daunting sometimes, especially for some of the families that we serve who had a lot of interaction with social services. So another thing to just think about is calling it a conversation, or at least when it feels like that's an appropriate way to describe. But you have to have good conversational skills. You have to be curious. You have to know how to go deep, how to ask that next level question, how to know when families can go deeper with you. And as we'll talk about later, be able to carry the conversation with some of our families that really aren't ready or cannot go a little bit deeper and are really at the yes/no level. How could you carry the conversation? So good conversational skills is a must as well. And again, all skills we can gain, all skills we can gain. So definition and purpose. The routines-based interview, semi-structured. We're gathering information about children and families. We are putting it into the IFSP. Some states go ahead and use it for IEPs, which is awesome. We are going to end up with functional outcomes, a lot of relevant information, but the most important part of it is we are starting a positive relationship with the family in a really short amount of time. And that is essential, because as we jump into our work, we don't have a lot of time. We don't have the luxury like we would with a friend of not getting to these kind of in-depth conversations until a couple months down the road when we're more used to each other. Families, we get pretty intimate with families pretty quickly in early intervention, and the routines-based interview and its structure is designed to understand that and to help you and the family develop a positive relationship in a really short amount of time. So just a graph for you, or a image for you to really think visually about where the RBI fits in IFSP, but also in primary service provider. The routines-based interview is uniquely suited to primary service provider. And I'll probably emphasize this a couple of interview, because you just cannot adequately um, retell what happened during the RBI, and in a way that is as good as being there yourself. And so also the notes to the RBI really should be relatively short with stars and things. So I don't know how, other than, I thought maybe we might be able to record it or something like that. But other than that, unless you're there, you're just not going to get the richness. But more importantly, you're not going to establish the relationship with the family with the right person, right? We want the family to establish that relationship with the primary service provider. And we want that primary service provider to begin to fall a little bit in love with that family. So we also are going to determine services and outcomes from the RBI. To start with some big do's and don'ts, just because not sure we'll get through everything today, to be honest. And these are the things that are some of the most important things to think about with an RBI. So first of all, from years of experience, the most important thing you can do is have a really good conversation with the parents. And I don't care who has that conversation. It can be the person at intake. It can be when you walk in the door for the RBI. But you really need to spend some time with the family, with the parent, to help them understand the purpose of this conversation, to help them understand that the information is about needs. Well, let me back up a little bit. To do that, you have to understand why you're having that conversation. So part of the refresher, part of hope that you retrain or there's lots of resources and a book on RBI. First, you have to understand why we're doing what we're doing. So when you understand it, I think it's easier to explain it to the parents. And what we're doing is really looking at needs again. We're not looking for deficits. If we really, 20 years ago, that's what our assessments were about, is going in and looking at deficits. We know that's not the way we do business now. We also know it's a way to really set in the mind of parents early on a ableist view of their children. So what we're doing is we are helping the family to understand that in early intervention, what we want to do is we want to make sure that your daily activities go a little bit smoother, and to understand what their needs are in reference to that. So we also want to make sure that families understand that this information stays with the early intervention program, that the information is used next to fill out the IFSP, which helping them understand that is sort of a documentation of everything we talk about from the time we meet till the time we start services. And it helps us understand who they need on their team, what services they'll get, and also some outcomes or goals that we'll work on together. Most importantly, families need to understand they are not obligated to answer anything that we ask, and only give us as much information as they need to. And I can't emphasize enough why we should do that upfront time, except to tell you that so many parents that I work with, and probably the last 8 years I've worked more with parents than ever before. They don't understand why we do what we do because we just don't take the time to explain why we do what we do. And the last time I served a parent in Kansas, the parent eventually shared with me that the first time a team came in and did the RBI, they spent that whole night worrying that somehow they said something that would make them lose their child. And I feel like just a short explanation ahead of time of what we were doing versus just jumping into it might have prevented that. So I'll get off my soapbox now, but make sure not only with this step, but every step, that parents understand why we're doing what we do in as clear as message as we can. So we do use this information to develop outcomes, and later we use this information in the intervention. Never should we do an RBI and then it just goes on a shelf. We should see what was discussed in the RBI in the priorities concerns area. We should see what went into the RBI conversation show up in outcomes and goals, not just in the present level of development. Spending 2 hours sharing that much of your life and then not seeing it in a goal or an outcome is particularly upsetting to parents. And we also need to find out, again, what needs there are in routines, and those needs get targeted within the routine. So think about that for a minute. We're there to find out the needs within the routine, and those are the needs that get targeted in the routines. We've talked about, we do need the most likely PSP at the interview. And also we're looking for child goals in the interview. We're looking for child-related family goals, something like, I want some more information on Down syndrome or autism. I want to learn sign language. Those are child-related family goals. And family level. So those might be basic needs, which we know, and again, in understanding family functioning, that unless basic needs are met, nothing else really is going to happen. So we're really talking about and thinking about basic needs for families, with the caveat that that doesn't mean you have to be the person to solve that, but you have to enact your community resources to help solve that. So it might be utility, shelter, et cetera, a job, or they might be family self-actualizing goals. So more time for the primary caregiver for themselves, more time for the couple, more time for me to go back to school and figure out how to do everything I need to do for my family and go back to school at the same time. With lots of challenges, I just didn't want to forget to say this, when we meet a family and we do the interview, and there are a lot of needs during every one of their routines, we may write several outcomes. So we may identify several goals. I know that we have IFSP outcomes, but really in the interview, you're identifying goals that we turn into outcomes, just to get our verbiage right. So with some children, think about autism, think about some significant behavior support needs. There may be so many needs during every routine of the day. And so what we'll do with families is to say, let's pick one routine at a time, and let's focus on the needs in that routine. And the rest of the day, you just chill, don't worry about it. But there are a lot of ways to do this that are also individualized and meet the needs of the family. So that's going a little bit into intervention, but it really, I think, is important in the interview for parents to understand that just because we identify their goals doesn't mean we are going to ever work on them all at one time. We are going to prioritize, which is part of the routines-based interview, and sort of go down the line. So some other terminology I hope you remember, and some don'ts. We are, even though it's called the routines-based interview, and even though many of the resources that McWilliam has designed, say like breakfast, lunch, dinner, hanging out time, truly the routines-based interview is not routines as we typically think about them. They're times of day, right? So breakfast may mean for some family noon, and dinner, of course, is 8 or 9 o'clock at night, if not later. So whenever we do the routines-based interview, we never start with, well, what do you do at breakfast? Well, we never start there anyway, because we always start with, what do you do, family member, mom, dad, grandma, grandpa? What happens the minute you wake up? And then we go down, not when the child wakes up, but when the family member wakes up. And then The next question we ask is what happens next? What happens next? What happens next when we feel a family has completed a routine? Versus what happens when you wake up? What happens at breakfast? And that way we're not assuming that these routines happen in a specific way, or that they even happen with families. So always remember, though we're talking about routines, your biggest question is what happens next? And again, not an interview in terms of an interrogation. We don't keep spitting the questions until, we feel like we get a satisfactory answer. It's a conversation, and that's where your good conversation skills need to come in, because you have to have the skill to go deeper with families, and help them learn how to have that skill to go a little bit deeper into their times of day and what's happening during that time of day. Often when we feel it's an interrogation, it's because we're sort of trying to ask enough questions to get to honestly, the deficit that we see or thing we want to figure out what's going wrong during that routine, and maybe nothing is. So conversation, developing a relationship. And we don't use the routine-based interview to figure out, again, what a child is bad at. We're not looking for the deficits. We're not looking for a deficit, and then we're not going to go looking for a routine where we can work on it. We're looking at their times a day or routines, and we are looking at what we can do to intervene during those times a day or routines. So again, we're not using it to figure out what the child can't do and then look for a routine to embed, working on what they can't do. We're looking for a routine and what interventions needed to make it go well. I think I already talked about that. One thing parents will tell you makes them a little crazy. And also, we should never say to each other is we don't really talk about, like, sometimes people are afraid the interview itself will overwhelm families, or how many goals turn into outcomes will overwhelm families. We don't know what will overwhelm families. We have no right to make that assumption for them. If they tell us they're overwhelmed, then they need to stop. If we see their faces, if we see their body actions, but we're not going to assume for families, especially before we even go into the work. We're especially not going to assume based on educational level or socioeconomic level or race or ethnicity. Quite honestly, it's discrimination. So we want to stay away from making assumptions on the behalf of families. We want to really work hard on not worrying so bad that the family's going to miss a need. First of all, we're not looking for skill deficits, and we are not going to worry about missing a skill deficit, because when we work on needs, we're working on the development of the child. You'll get there. You'll get there. You don't have to name it. You'll get there. We are going to work on, breakfast is the place that goes, haywire, and it's because mom has to feed the baby and 2-year-old. We're going to work on, maybe one of the things we want to work on is have the 2-year-old learn self-feed habits, how to feed themselves a little bit better, that sort of thing. So we don't need to worry, and we don't need to worry if a family misses a need that we see, because it'll come up. This isn't the only time you'll see the family. You're going to visit the family, hopefully, quite often, and you'll see and have a chance to talk about those things you think the family missed. We don't write goals for less anything, like we don't want him to have less tantrums, just basic communication, basic behavior. We don't use negative terms, right? What we want to do is paint a picture of what we do want. So we do want Johnny to get through breakfast without having a tantrum, versus we want less tantrums at breakfast, if that makes sense. It's that mental piece of painting a positive goal and working towards it. And again, can't emphasize enough, we have to change the paradigm. in early intervention, in special education, that we've long lived with. We don't focus on deficits. We focus on strengths. And we do not promote ableism by focusing on deficits. We focus on strengths. And when we focus on routines and times of the day, that is the most effective way that we can avoid focusing on deficits, because we're going to focus on what we need to do to get through that routine. The reason the RBI came to be is to dispel some myths that we have. The routines-based interview is meant to bring the parents into intervention in the strongest way possible, because children don't learn during the home visit. We are not with children long enough as professionals to even consider the fact that we've made a difference in their lives. And I know you all know that. And I know you all know a lot of what I'm saying. Again, this is a refresher. But it's all of the hours in between our visits, right? And so we have to engage the parents within their daily routines and activities at home and community. And sometimes we need to engage their childcare or their preschool, especially if it's over 15 hours a week. If a preschool's even under 15 hours a week, that's like 1/6 of the child's life. So we can't assume all the learning's happening there either. There's a myth that parents are non-compliant, that the RBI helps to work against, because if we do the RBI right, we're working on things that are important to the family. And we're also acknowledging that even if it's important to the family, there might be another reason they can't get to it, a basic family need, safety, jobs, etc. And we're going to help figure out what that is and get some support so they can get to those needs that are so important for them and on behalf of their children. And the RBI helps us to understand that all families belong in early intervention. All families can support their children. All families can benefit from a routines-based interview. There's no such thing as some families have no routines, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. So let's breathe for a minute together. When do you know it? You did an RBI well? These are the 3 questions you have to ask yourself. So do you walk away from your RBIs right now feeling like you had a positive relationship started? Did you feel like you got a rich and thick enough description of the functioning? Like to get started at least on a routine where the needs were identified? Not going to get the same amount of information from every family, but do you feel good about I've at least got a place to start? And did you get a pretty decent list of functional goals, which really are the needs of the family during the routine, and some family-centered goals or needs of the family during their routines or their life? That's when we know we've done an RBI well. If we walk away and feel like these were accomplished, then we're okay. So to give you a break from my voice, we're going to watch a video of a routines-based interview. Some of you may have seen it before, just to remind us a bit about what it could look like. Now, this is it's not a 3-month or a 6-month or an annual. It's really this mom had a new need. And so her provider felt like they needed to do a bit of an interview to really get more information about this new need. So let's take a look at it.
So Leslie, you mentioned outings and how that can be. So let's kind of talk about that. What does getting ready for an outing for you look like?
Well, we usually get dressed, and I maybe take one child to the car. So, you know, with the road being, our road is very busy, but leave one child here, take one in the car, and then take the other in, and we go.
Okay. And so once they're in the car, everything okay there?
Sometimes, yeah, but pretty much not too bad, not too bad.
What are some things they might do on a car ride?
We have our songs, I have the songs in the car. Usually we listen to that and just I like sing a little bit, but
Yeah. Do they like car rides?
sometimes.
When they do like it, how do you know they like it?
They may lag and they look at each other and laugh or they sleep.
Yes. Yeah. And what about long car rides? You said they get to sleep. Are long car rides harder?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
What would make them harder?
Usually if they don't take a nap, Josiah will take a nap. Ariana usually does, but if he doesn't take a nap, then usually he's very upset for being in the car for a long time.
And what does he do when he's upset?
Scream.
Will that last a long time?
Yes, he will go on as long as he needs to.
Okay. So from the time that you start your car rides, getting ready till the time you actually get somewhere, you know, we've been rating things on a scale of 1 to 5, 1 being awful, coffee, right? How would you rate the car rides?
I would say, well, that could depend, but I would probably say overall about 3.5. Can I do that, John?
Sure, it's your rating.
Okay, so just a little snippet, but hopefully you saw some, at least they already had a positive relationship, but a continued relationship. It's comfortable, they're laughing, there's eye contact, all those great things we learned about communication. One of the reasons is, at least at a beginning IFSP or a beginning RBI, to have a second person go with you is to take the notes. The person that you just watched is a really experienced RBI interviewer. And so they are really good at taking the notes and keeping the communication going with eye contact and body language and et cetera. But as a new person, new to the interview, you may not have that ability to do both at the same time. So that's when you'll probably want a second person, if not always. You heard a bit about a little bit about description of functioning, and they will likely be able to get a goal out of that. As you watch this interview, they end up talking all about the car ride and how well it goes, and maybe some the needs during it is sort of figuring out how to get 3 children in a van and keep them happy on long rides to medical appointments. So you can imagine they came out with a lot of great goals that could be turned into outcomes. So I'm going to move a bit more now into exploring the RBI a bit more. How do you install it? How do you implement it? And how do you perfect it? So I think we've talked about all of those pretty well. So some other top signs that you need the RBI, and also reminders of why we do the RBI. You are finding yourself writing IFSPs when you're really not certain of those family priorities for their child and family, or you're feeling a little bit like the priorities are really the priorities of you and your colleagues versus the family. You need an RBI when you feel like there's some pretty limited family participation in your IFSP development. An RBI is really helpful when we end up with really ambiguous outcomes and goals. Helps to tighten things up. When we have too few outcomes or too many goals. We need an RBI, especially when families do have a limited or vague understanding of their children's natural learning opportunities, or when you have a limited or vague understanding of where that child has their natural learning opportunities. I know both McWilliams and Sheldon and Rush emphasize that our outcomes should come from natural learning opportunities, and those only exist in the routines and daily activities of families. And the other thing that RBI really helps with is caregiver implementation of the intervention strategies. If you're really pulling the priorities, if you are really pulling the outcomes from the RBI, you got buy-in because you are right where you need to be. You're in the middle of that routine, you're talking about a need the family has, and you're helping to solve it. And families are going to be really interested in implementing at that point. So we've talked a lot about those things. We'll talk about later. Oh, daily routines. Define those to the parents before you start. We don't assume parents understand routines is a jargon word. So daily routines, that means, you know, what happens during breakfast, pretend I'm a fly on the wall, pretend that you're closed captioning a television show. Just tell me what's happening, who's there, what do you know, what's going on and who's doing what. We'll have to define routines to families. We're going to talk a little bit later about those time we're in change questions and why they're so important. And again, making sure we get child outcomes and family outcomes at the end. A reminder of what an RBI can do for you. So, time to chat in, just take a few minutes. I'm not going to, this is more for you to talk to each other a bit in the chat function, but we will not stop and sort of go over those, but again, help you reflect with others. But take some time to chat and let us know what you think you need to do to improve in development of your IFSPs. And think a bit about how much you feel like you've been attending to family needs through the IFSP, just as much as you're comfortable sharing, or jot it down on a piece of paper beside you. But those are, you know, a couple self-reflection questions for us, and we all need to continually engage in that self-reflection. I'll keep going while you're doing that, because these are some reminders, right? Those of you that have been doing RBIs, which I assume probably all of you, at least done a few, we're going to be asking about the family's main concerns. How does their day begin? What does their child do? How much help do they need? How do they talk and get along with others? What is everyone doing during the routine? How happy are you with this time of day? So we have to, all the parts, fidelity means all the parts. So we're going to prioritize, we're going to star, all the great things that we are taught to do in an RBI. And then we're going to ask what happens next, not what happens at lunch or dinner, but what happens next. Emphasizing what everyone else is doing, we can have the parent tell us everything about what the child uses at breakfast. I always use breakfast because it's one of the most detailed part of the day that we get. And also kind of breakfast, lunch, and dinner are often the same routine. So it might be the place that we get a lot of information about how meals go. But what we often get is a description of what just that child is doing. And we don't know what else is going on. So we don't know that maybe the, 6-year-old sister also has to get supported to get ready for school, or they're eating too, or at the same time, the other partner's getting ready to leave for work. So there's maybe more going on than we think. And so some of our interventions might not make as much sense if we don't know what else is going on with everyone else. And again, that's one of those times a day that you want to explain to the parent why you're asking, like, I'm not just being snoopy about what everybody else in the family is doing. It helps us to understand what's going on, what might be impacting the need during the intervention time, and who might be able to help. So those are some of our main things we're going to ask. And if you boiled an RBI down to just the basics, here's just the basics. Just to stop to remind you that the RBI does have some data behind it. It's not something that we only use in Kansas. The RBI is used in a number of states. As we said before, it also is mentioned in IDEA, not the like Robbins RBI, but doing an RBI is mentioned in IDEA Part C. But there's also several articles in Infants and Young Children that talk about some of the research that they've done behind the RBI if you're interested. So let's talk a bit about something else the RBI can do, and that's build family resilience. We know, especially since the pandemic, that this is a critical piece. Sorry, I got distracted by chat just a minute. Yeah, I see some questions that we're going to get to. Okay, great, making sure. Resilience is critical, but also we are working sometimes with families that have experienced trauma, not just due to the pandemic, but the number of reasons we know why our children and families have been exposed to trauma. When you look at some of the trauma interview techniques, some of the most important parts of trauma building resistance is, first of all, feeling a locus of control. Like as the parent, as the family, as the child, as they get older, I have control and authority over what's happening here. And also understanding that, again, it's a conversation designed to support what's going on in my life. But that's only helpful to families if then that conversation does support what's going on in their life. So RBI definitely is aligned with building family resilience, supporting families who've experienced trauma. It's also a great tool for when you're looking at equity-based practices, because again, as long as we're not assuming breakfast, lunch, dinner, but we're just asking what happens next, and we're truly exploring and not judging the routines of the family, then families can build their own story. Families can tell you who they are, what's happening, what's important to them, and really feel like they are in a place that absolutely accepts and supports them and understands them and makes an attempt to understand and listen to them. So the way that we build family resistance is by describing the day, by having families self-identify their needs and their aspirations, and by feeling empowerment and resilience. Like I have a role in this. I have control and authority. I can help make changes with my child. It builds family capacity. And for us, it's really about knowing that we're giving support-based home visits and we're learning about the family. Every conversation is learning about the family so that we can support the family in a stronger way, so that we can build the family's capacity, while at the same time they're describing their day, stating their needs and aspirations, and building empowerment resilience. Great tool for lots of reasons. So, second, let me fix this. Yeah, I'm trying to make, just a second. I can't reach this, there we go. Sorry, got to talk while I move. So RBI and family resilience, let's talk a little bit about that. If families are stressed, this actually helps them feel more supported. If they're experiencing a big change, it's a really good time to at least do a mini RBI or a review of some conversations so they can begin to plan the new routines. If there's a transition to a new provider, that might be a time to do an RBI. If they're moving or there's a new baby coming, definitely, I mean, just common sense tells us those routines aren't going to be the same anymore. So it's really helping knowing to sort of think ahead when families are experiencing a big change and they need to look at their routines again, or they're going to have new routines. It helps them identify the routines they want to change, not the routines that someone else thinks they should change, but the routines that they want to change. And after the routines-based interview, hopefully the intervention is routines-based as well, and families feel pretty confident and competent, and they've reported that they have feel like they are part of the solution and support of their child's needs. So I think that we all probably would agree that RBIs after meaningful outcomes to the caregivers. We're capitalizing on learning opportunities and without embedding made up routines, sorry, lack of a better word right now, non-functional outcomes, non-functional things. So functional means we're working on their participation. And so it's got to be something that they're already doing or hope to do. And again, helping to build families' resilience and promoting capacity and promoting strong families. So again, in the chat, I would love for you to identify what in all of your interviews, what is the richest routine of the day? Where do you get the most information? Which one do you love talking about? And what's the most difficult time of the difficult routine that families share with you when you think about over across all the families that you've talked about? And if you're talking to caregivers, what routines often lead to low engagement? So let's take a few minutes here in the chat, leave the questions up there, and share with me a little bit about what you've found. I love how you all are also having a great conversation, solving each other's questions. So I see some great questions and some great solutions in the chat. Mealtime and bedtime seem to be the richest part of the day, or maybe mealtime's the richest and bedtime's the most challenging. Not sure how to read that. Outings are challenging. After dinner, kind of normally evening time, the chill time, but then bedtime, more difficult. Bedtime, evening family time, probably the richest. Hanging out, yeah, when families have time to be with each other, it seems to go a little better. Morning times, they talk more, going out in the community, especially with some of our little ones. That looks like a lot of agreement about when sort of the easier times are. Some hope that you could go deeper on other meals. Okay. All right, great responses there. It's really identifying some of those times and maybe why some of those times are a little tougher. Again, the hope of the RBI is we're promoting capacity and resilience, right? And so if we're working on that horrible time of the day, the time of the day that any of us would give away to someone else, and bedtime's often it, right after mom and dad get home from, or not mom and dad, whoever is in the family, the partner or partners in the family, kind of, and the children all kind of get home for the day, trying to make supper, trying to get things going for the evening. That's often a really difficult time of the day. So I think, thinking about the power of that, like if we help families work on their needs during the most difficult time of the day, we're promoting their capacity and their resilience. And we're also building skills that that they need in other situations. So when we get worried about, well, what if they don't know this, or what if they don't know that? When parents are working with us and brainstorming with us on how to meet their needs, they're also building their own repertoire of how to respond to needs, right? When we're not around. We will talk about classrooms a little bit more. I saw in the chat, a couple of you talked about childcare and what to do there. I will tell you, while we're talking about routines, the most difficult time to engage children is circle time. You probably all know that, but some providers have really great circle times because they can keep all the kids engaged. But if all the kids aren't engaged at the same time, circle time is probably going to be your tough time. So that said, just reminding ourselves the link between RBI and service delivery. Definitely what we're collecting should go into what we do, go into supporting the families, right? So we're thinking about functioning or what happens during every part of the day and how well is it going, and participation and engagement, and independence, and what are the family needs, what are the routines, we're getting those outcomes, we're getting context for the outcomes, we're working during those routines when we get there. And then children develop more skills, families develop more, a bigger repertoire of tools in their toolbox for helping their children during all the routines, and they feel enriched and empowered and supported. So let me do a time check here. Maybe have to speed up just a bit. Who's involved with the RBI? One of the things we haven't really focused on here is hopefully you all have access to a routines-based interview form, and we'll also send one out as a resource. But when you go through the training, after you've got all of the routines written down, we're going to go back really quickly with the family. Probably your starring concerns during the whole time. When a parent expresses a need that they'd like to work on, it gets a star. And at the very end, we recap those stars. So we're not going to go over the whole interview at the end. We're going to be like, okay, these 10 stars stood out. Which one of the 10 do you want to concentrate on? And that's when we prioritize and we write down the outcomes, and then we recheck the priority order. So again, every part of the RBI and how it's designed to work has a really important function. So really reviewing that or being able to take part in RBI training will help you get more used to that. And it's a practice thing, right? The more you actually practice all the pieces and do it with fidelity, the easier it'll come. Lots of people can be involved. That's really about your program, service coordinators, providers, evaluators, et cetera. But again, really trying to get that primary service provider or potential primary service provider there. Think about who should be there and why, what's their function, and when it should be done. And again, we talked about that a little bit more. It might be different in each of your programs. But I saw some things in the chat that talked about, do I do the AEPS first or do I do the RBI first? And some great responses to say, well, if you do the RBI first, you're going to have a lot of information you can just transfer right away. Definitely. So great thinking about that. Implementing the RBI, what should it look like? Where does it fit in? How do you make sure you're using it with fidelity, the resources, tools, training that's available? We're going to get to some misconceptions. So I'll probably speed over some of the little things so we can get to those misconceptions, which I know you all have some questions about. So if you are familiar with the RBI, you know that we're asking what's everybody doing in the routine, but specifically with our child, that is the focus child. Are they engaged? What are they doing independently? What are they doing in terms of their social relationships? Who are they talking to? Who are they playing with? Remember that engagement, non-engagement doesn't mean they're just sitting in a corner, right? Non-engagement means that during this routine, they're wandering away or they're having a tantrum or other signs that they're just not engaged. And when we figure out how to engage the child and how to improve their independence and their social relationship during that routine, we figure out how to meet the needs of that routine. We ask the family, how satisfactory are it? They may describe the most chaotic routine in the world and they're like, I'm good with it. And guess what? Then you're good with it. They're telling you the routines they need the most help with. List of lots of routines you'll hear when you say what's next. Always good to have those in your pocket in case families aren't like in the groove of thinking through their day with us yet. And same thing with classroom routines. But you should always ask what's next and make sure the family's not stumbling with where to go next. So again, engagement, independence, social behavior. Non-engaged is passive attention, repetitive behavior, et cetera, et cetera. Independence, what's the child do by themselves? Can the child be left to participate without assistance? How do they let you know they need help? How do they respond when you give them help? Who gives them help? Sometimes this is really important because we may identify a need. And this is where you get to use your child development because you might be able to help the family understand that that's really something they could do on their own. Would you like to work on that? Struggle at bedtime, they won't lay down by themselves. Well, if that's something you want to work on, they're developmentally, I think they can lay down by themselves. So let's work on some of those. It's where we can do some intervention. Communication, how are they communicating? How are they responding to communication, expressing themselves? How sophisticated is it at the level that we would expect for a child their age? What mode do they use? How easy is it for them to be understood? Most children in the age group that we serve, if mom and dad can understand them, that's meeting the need, that the parents have. And if mom and dad can understand them, there's probably a need there. How cooperative are they? How do they interact with other adults than mom and dad? How do they respond to correction from adults? That's part of social relationships. What kind of correction do adults provide? Another time when your child development may be able to come into play when we're talking about goals or outcomes or interventions. Everything you do hinges on the follow-up question. So if you're doing an RBI and you're just going in and asking all the questions on the form, we are we're missing the point of the RBI. We have to be skilled enough to get the details of the child's functioning or what they're doing during that routine, the details of what the family's doing during that routine. We have to just get a rich picture, again, just helping the family, if I'm a fly on the wall, what am I seeing? If I can take a picture right now, what do I see? Just find some of those phrases that you can can use to help families see what we're looking for. I don't think we'll skip that chat for this for now. Let's see. Oops, I'm trying to use my table to turn it. Noting concerns, again, just a reminder, you have short notes. You star the concerns, mostly the parents, but you can star your own concerns and come back to that. Of course, during that conversation, we're going to say, I noticed this. Is that that was something I thought might be a concern or was a concern for me? Is that a concern for you? There's nothing that says we can't note that, but that doesn't mean we're noting deficits. We're noting something we heard that appears to be a need because it's interfering with the child's engagement or independence or participation in the routine or social relationships. So we think about outcome selection. Now, don't let this blow your mind. Robin likes 10 to 12 outcomes or goals. 6 is his absolute minimum. I think in Kansas, we tend to chunk ours a little bit differently, which I'm not saying do it differently. So just, in RBI Fidelity, this is, and also you'll see in a minute some examples of the kind of goals Robin would come up with in RBI and see where they're just a little more separated than some of the goals I think we're used to writing, but still the same content, the same meat. So for example, here's 5 goals. Taking food by mouth during the meals, making meaningful communication during play and evening family time, playing independent, not needing my attention, letting me leave the room without crying, diaper time going easier, less fussing, walking, playtime, outings outside. So again, non-functional outcomes would look a little bit different and not be in the times of engagement, independence, and social relationships. And if you think about those 3, so taking food by mouth is independence, meaning communication, single words, we're talking about that social communication piece. Playing independently, independence, diaper time going easier. That's I don't know where I'd put that, maybe independence, maybe social relationships. And of course, walking, playtimes, outings, etc., is a huge independence factor. Going out on outings, a lot of you mentioned outings being a point that families really struggle with. Studying, but we'll see family things like studying for a promotion exam, one of the parents having time for themselves, organizing their days, finding a good school when they're moving. They're definitely, we would want to see and hope to see family priorities as well. So again, I saw some concerns about time of an interview. Yes, we don't have a lot of time in our 45 days. There are some ways to brainstorm that. I'm sure your kids, your own teams brainstormed it. You've gone to your kids' consultants to brainstorm it. Sometimes having a good interview means rethinking how we do a lot of things. One example came up today. If we don't have one meeting to do the APS and one meeting to do the RBI, we're buying ourselves some time, right? So those 2 hours, minimum 1 hour, is an investment for, average time of a child in early intervention, I think is like 14 months. You're investing 14 months. Now we've got the pressure of the 45 days and how do we deal with that? Those are real. I'm not even going to attempt to solve that for your teams, but we need to find a way to make sure it's at least 2 hours, minimally 1 hour. So we've talked about the kind of goals we would get. Want to do some reminders on interview behavior. Just take a look at this. You're natural. You have to know this, practice it, feel good about it, feel at ease with that about it. So you can have the parent feel at ease. All the good communication things, talk to the parent, look them in the eye. Don't be writing your notes the whole time. Jargon, make sure that you do those positive affirmations for what the parent says. Express admiration for what the parent does. Find those places in there where you're like, wow, that's awesome. It's great that you do that. You're building a relationship, so don't fail to take the time to do some of that. Ask about their feelings, be comfortable with feelings. Parents may cry during this process. We have to be comfortable with that. You can use some self-disclosure, or what is called therapeutic use of self. We don't go overboard with that, but I don't even think of an example, but everybody bedtime, I might say, yeah, bedtime was always the worst time for me when I had, was raising my children. I understand, something like that. Just use that self-disclosure, humor as a communication technique. Handle the crying appropriately, and respect cultural conversational norms. And so understanding again and respecting that some families may say nothing. There's techniques for us to deal with that. Some families may give you so much that the interview is going to take like 4 hours if we don't find a way to kind of bring that back a little bit. So that's, on both ends of the continuum, we've got to have the skills to deal with that. If we're talking about emotional topics, respond in a sensitive way to that. We are honored with so much information from families that is so hard for them to share. And it's a privilege that we have it. And so really dealing with those emotional topics in a sensitive way is so important. So important what we say in terms of how they see themselves as the parent. So important in how they see their child's abilities and the trajectory that their child's on. With families that are separated, make sure we're not engaging in any judgmental talk about the other parent at any time for any reason whatsoever. Ask detailed questions at the beginning. If necessary, like if breakfast was really full and you're running out of time, you can skip lunch and go to supper, that sort of thing, make those sort of decisions. So again, those are our 6 questions. We already talked about the skills you need. We'll talk about the echo map someday, possibly. We've talked about who was there. Let's talk about teacher interviews. A couple people talked about interviewing child care. And if a child is with somewhere else over 15 hours a week, it makes every sense in the world to do an interview there. You can do it 2 ways. The teacher can be present during the parent interview as they go through home routine and arrival at school. And then the teacher talks about the school routines. And then when the parent takes over when home routines begin again, and then you recap both the home and school concerns, and the parent picks up and sets the goals for home and school, which is really kind of cool because for those parents, like someone mentioned, they don't even know what goes on at school. So if at all possible, that's a really great way to do it. But I know, again, it's a time concern and getting people together. You can also do it by getting permission with the teacher or from the parent to interview the teacher. Make sure you get that permission. And interview the teacher about those school routines. The parent interview can be separate. So you're interviewing the parent up to the time they get up to the childcare, and the teacher from the childcare to the time that they go home. And then you recap them both, but the parent's always the one picking the goals that become outcomes for home and school. The parent is the decider. Once they review what the teacher went over. This is where I want to talk a bit about workarounds. There are some places and spaces that have moved the RBI to, or at least they've done sort of a shorter version of the RBI and then did a more complete version once services started. Really not the best way to do it, but there are workarounds for everything, right? So just remember that and think about that. We do have some Fidelity tools, and we'll send you a Fidelity checklist that's got some great reminders for you on that Fidelity checklist. So want to take a little bit of time to address some misconceptions, like the RBI is not for every family, and we don't ask the worry and change questions, and what happens when there's a new baby, there's no routines yet. Articulation's the only concern, so I don't need to do an RBI. It takes too long. Can't we get this information in other ways? What if I think we already dealt with the last two. Follow that for a minute. Just want to deal with some of those misconceptions with you and maybe use the chat a little bit here. Jenny, we have not long, huh? 8 minutes? Okay, we'll hit some of the biggest misconceptions and then send some others out. So that new baby, the first one to really maybe think about, no, the new baby's not going to have a lot of routines. They poop, they eat, that repeats. Oh yeah, they sleep too. That repeats, but the parent has so many new routines that they need to think through. And that's where our conversation is, right? The routine of the parent figuring out how to get done what they need to get done and support this new baby, etc. If a parent is nonverbal, what do? That's the time, and I would say one of the only times we really start using more yes/no questions. And so we can get to, what happens at breakfast, and then if needed, does she eat with a spoon herself? What do you do? Do you pour the cereal for her, or does she pour it for herself? So only when you really have a pretty nonverbal parent do we kind of resort to those yes/no questions, and you can talk about more about that in a fuller training. But it's really the time to help the conversation along a little bit. Interruptions, maybe that's why you bring a second person. Interruptions might be used, if there's interaction, just jump back into the routine, like we do. You're all very accomplished in that, but it doesn't have to stop the RBI. Sometimes it's nice. You'd be like a parent that's been, kind of going super long and be like, okay, this is where we were now, let's round that up, right? Or I heard this need, let's talk about that. So that's true. One of the big things is, what if a family has no routines? That's absolutely no family exists that has no routines. Every family has a routine. Yes, I love that you're sharing nonverbal family. I wish we had tons of time for you to talk to each other. Share those tips that you use. Every family has a routine. And because every child has to eat, and every child has to sleep, and everybody goes to bed sooner or later. And so the best way to get at the fact that we understand that every child has a routine is to just keeping that, what happens next, and keeping our judgment out of it. Again, not having routines like ours doesn't mean there's anything at all to worry about with that family. Just they have different routines, right? So we respect that. Foster care, who do we interview? Sometimes people are a little bit concerned about that. The point is to interview anyone who's spending more than 15 hours a week with a child. And so, there's so much tricky with foster care. Who then picks the outcomes. As much as we can get, biological parents involved in that, we'd want to, but also respecting, foster parents who are spending a good percentage of time with them. It's a little bit like doing an interview with a child care provider. You can do it the same way, or understanding that that's not always going to work in foster care, then we would primarily interview the foster parent. What do we do if there's no concerns? I'll have to tell you another day because it's time to go. But really, when there's no concerns, that's when we have to be better at asking questions, and maybe some yes and no questions. And if nothing else, we can ask parents, so awesome, it's going well. What do you want to do? You know, by the time they're 6 months older, a year older, what's that routine going to look like? So that's where we can go. Anyway, sorry we had a short amount of time. Sorry, mainly just talked at you, but we hopefully can, we're going to look at the interest in or need for sort of a RBI training. So you'll probably be asked that question where you'll talk and you'll talk about in practice and all of those good things. So as we close up, let me look at the chat one more time. Does anyone have anything we didn't get to in the last 2 minutes? I'll also look at the chat and work with Tammy and Jenny to get any information to you that we have missed, or any information to you, the information that I already mentioned to you, the fidelity checklist, a couple of examples of RBI forms. I think that's mainly it. Turn it back to Jenny.
Peggy, thank you so much for presenting today. And just a reminder to all those in attendance that you will get a certificate after the completion of the fourth FSC training, as long as you were able to attend each session live. I do post the recordings in Basecamp along with any resources in the PowerPoint, so you will have access to that to share with other people who weren't able to attend as well. Our next FSC training is on March 9th from 9 to 10:30. Thank you so much for joining and have a great day.
Thank you. Good luck.